My name is Ed Hale, and I'm a retired history teacher from Keystone Oaks, but this classroom, this classroom was actually my 9th grade civics classroom, so this is old home week for me, being back in this room again. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Before I start my talk on the great Castle Shannon bank robbery, I always give a shameless plug for the other talk that I do, which is on my other favorite subject, which is the U.S. brig Niagara. I'm a crew member on board that ship. We sail the 5 Great Lakes every summer, and this is a ship that was built for the War of 1812. This, obviously, it's a reproduction, but it is virtually identical to the original ship. And so I give a talk on what it's like to sail on board today and what it was like for the sailors on board in 1813 when the ship fought the Battle of Lake Erie and was the victor in that battle, which changed the direction of the war of 1812. So that's my plug. So if you like what you hear tonight, maybe you'll be so kind as to invite me back and let me go on about my other favorite topic. So tonight, we're going to talk about the Great Castle Shannon bank robbery, May 14th, 1917. I like to let people know ahead of time when I talk about this that the information I'm going to give you is as accurate as it could possibly be. We spent quite a bit of time researching this, and when I say we, my friend Roger Stewart, who was a Post Gazette writer, and we wrote a very large article for the Post Gazette that was published back in 1997. As I go through this, I'm going to be giving you quotes and saying some things that you might listen to and think, that's not possible, or that just is too incredible. Well, all of the story is backed up from the trial transcripts. We were able to get a hold of all the trial transcripts all the way up through the appellate court. We got eyewitness testimony. We got newspaper accounts. We have all sorts of very, very good information. So the story I'm going to tell you, as incredible as it will sound at some points, is absolutely true. I'm not making it up. I'm not that talented that I could make up a story this amazing. So, Castle Shannon in the early 1900s was basically a coal mining and a farming village. Very small. I don't even know what the census was there. I haven't bothered to look that up. But this is what Castle Shannon looked like in the early 1900s, looking from what at that time, or what today would be like Grove Road. If you're standing over on Grove Road at what was at that time called Saxon-Walled Nursery. Some of the older folks here might remember that, like me. Saxon-Walled Nursery was a huge nursery that was on the other side of 88 and looked over. So this is what Castle Shannon looked like. You can see the houses are relatively sparse. And one little piece of trivia, that's my church, which in 1911 they picked up, brought down this hill, ran it down the street, and dropped it on the vacant lot down below. An incredible feat, which I've also done some research on and actually talked to the grandson of the people who moved it. So it's a kind of interesting story in and of itself. But notice something that's missing when you look across that hillside. If you were to stand and look there today, you would see hundreds of trees. There are no trees. There's virtually no trees in that picture. And the reason was, in this time period, there were so many mines in this area that the trees were all being cut down, sent to the sawmills, sawn into timbers, and taken down into the mines, which, by the way, are still there and from time to time are falling in and causing mine subsidence. So all of that was lumbered out, and almost all the trees you see in Castle Shannon today are, not much more than 100 years old, if even that. This is downtown Castle Shannon, which remarkably is almost the same. It hasn't changed greatly. This is the bank, all right. This is, and I'm giving you some places to look at because all of this is going to come back in the story. Next to the bank is Martin's grocery store. This is the Oddfellows Hall. And at that time, it was apartments upstairs. And downstairs was like a meeting hall. Then you have what is today Willow Avenue. At that time, it was called Railroad Street, where the buildings that you see are still pretty much there, but have been remodeled and changed over the years. If you were to go into Castle Shannon today, here would be Myrtle Avenue School, and Vitty's would be right here. Castle Shannon had two hotels at that time, one called Hotel Waterman. The Waterman Hotel was right along what today would be 88. They're building a brew pub where the Waterman Hotel was. And the Waterman Hotel comes into a little play in the story also. And this tiny little baby sitting here, her name was Ray Phillips. Her brother was one of the bank tellers at the time of the robbery, and his name was William Waterman. He fortunately happened to go home for lunch just as the bank robbery takes place and survives. Anyway, so I interviewed her and talked to her a little bit about the bank robbery because obviously her brother had a lot to tell her about it as she was growing up. But she wasn't our eyewitness. I'll come back to the eyewitness in a little while. This is Willow Avenue today, or what's today is called Willow Avenue. At that time, it was called Railroad Street, and you can see it was just a mud track. This is what it looked like from the other end. That first picture was looking this way, now we're looking back. This is the Oddfellows Hall again, and Belts Hoover's store. If you look in Castle Shannon today,
it's the same track.
Okay, hasn't changed. Okay, it is pretty much the same today as it was then, and the bank is directly behind these buildings with the grocery store in between these buildings, grocery store, then the bank, which I just kind of want you to get some of that in your head because as the story unfolds, I want you to be able to kind of picture where some of these things are. This is what the bank looked like in 1917, and this picture was taken only weeks before the bank robbery, and these are the three tellers. We have Daniel McLean, who was the head teller, Frank Irby, who was the assistant, and then young William Waterman, who had just started and was learning all about banking. The bank today is virtually identical, again, and it is owned and used as a interior design service. The women that bought it turned into that. Now, something I want you to be aware of here. Notice that the steps come down to here, and you're right at street level. Well, the problem was that as motor cars developed, they wanted to connect this street, which is Poplar, which came to a dead end at Willow, and then there was an embankment, and then the railroad tracks ran through. So they wanted to connect that down to Castle Shannon Boulevard. In order to do that, they started grading the road about half a mile up and graded it down and down and down until these steps are now not anywhere near road level, but the road was graded down, down, down until it reached the streetcar tracks, or at that time they were railroad tracks. The bank robbery comes about as a result of 4 immigrants to Pittsburgh who were having trouble holding jobs because the truth was they were just bad guys. They were always in trouble, always being fired, and finding themselves unemployed. The leader was a guy whose name was Michel Titoff, or he went by Mike. All 4 of these men were from Russia. They knew each other from working in the mills together. They were friends. And Titoff and Tush lived together in one boarding house, and Barkhans and Haraska Garrison lived in another boarding house down in what's called the Soho area of Pittsburgh, which is behind Duquesne University in that area. Titoff had evidently been recently fired again from his job, and had, from the testimony, had taken a trip out to Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And to do so, he had to come through Castle Shannon. I'm not sure how he was traveling. I guess streetcar, or I'm not really sure how no one mentions how he got there. But he gets into Castle Shannon and he stops at the Waterman Hotel to have lunch. And he's sitting in the Waterman's Hotel, which, as I mentioned, is where McGinnis Brothers used to be in Castle Shannon. Now they're building a brew pub right there in the corner of Castle Shannon Boulevard in 88. And he's sitting there in the hotel having lunch, and he looks out, and straight across from him is the bank. And the bank seems to be sitting in the middle of nowhere. Here he is. It takes an hour or more to get from downtown Pittsburgh to Castle Shannon. This was, as far as he was concerned, wilderness area. This was way outside of civilization. He looks around. I guess he makes some inquiries. He finds out that there's no police that are in town. There's no jail in town. It's just a little village, a little hamlet. And he sees this imposing bank of this Greek revival architecture, and he decides that's an easy target. So he goes on, does his trip, comes home, and somewhere along the line, he hatches this plan with these 4 men of robbing the bank. Evidently, they actually did some preliminary checking on the bank. They made another trip out, at least Garrison and Titoff seemed to have gone out to the bank and went in with a $5 bill to ask for some change so they could see the layout of the inside of the bank and get a feel for what it looked like. So we know that they were there at least one time to check out the bank and the way the whole town was laid out. As they looked around, Titoff realized that if he's going to rob this bank, he couldn't leave on a streetcar, okay? That happens later. The Commuter Bandit, 1960s, do you remember the Commuter Bandit? Used to rob banks in downtown Pittsburgh, jump on a streetcar, and disappear, okay? Anyway, Titoff decides, I need a getaway car, a getaway driver to drive a car to get us out of town in a hurry. Titoff's sister ran a boarding house out in a place called Universal, which is now today Penn Hills. And he talks with his sister, doesn't tell her about the bank robbery from what we can tell, just tells her that he needs someone to drive him to Castle Shannon. Does she know anybody? And she says, you won't believe this, but I now have a boarder who lives in my house. His name is Nick Kemenos, and he just bought a Maxwell touring car, which in 1916 was the car. This was one of the best cars on the market, which tells us that Kemenos was well employed. Okay, and I want you to remember that. Kemenos paid at least $655 for this car, which in 1916, that was a chunk of change. So Kemenos has this car, and when Titoff finds out about it, he is elated, because if you want to make a fast getaway, you need a car that has an electric starter. Not a car that, as they're chasing you through town, you're down there cranking the car, hoping that it's going to kick over. So he decides that this is the car. And he asked Kemenos if he'd be interested in driving him and his friends into Castle Shannon sometime in the near future, because they wanted to go apply at one of the coal mines for a job. And Kemenos said, sure, $7. And they said, okay, $7, we'll pay you $7 to drive us to Castle Shannon and back. While Titoff and Garrison were in the town snooping around trying to figure out how this was going to work, they noticed, and I apologize for this lousy picture, but it's the best I can do. They noticed that this road leading out of town, which was called Washington Avenue, today it's Castle Shannon Boulevard, was the only paved road in the area. It was macadamized, or what today we would say asphalt. He realized that if they parked the car up on this street, that they could get in that car and that car could go as fast as possible and get away from these bunch of country bumpkins who would probably be chasing them in horse and buggy. And so they look this over and they decide, we're going to park right here in front of Dr. Brown's house. Dr. Brown's house is still there today, and it is lawyers that are using it today. Also, if you looked at Dr. Brown's house today, and I don't have a picture, I should go get a picture of this. Same thing, they lowered this road considerably. Here you see it, you can virtually walk in off the street. Today, there are probably 25 steps. They've lowered it that much. There was a huge hump coming out of Castle Shannon at that time. Right next to this, on the other side of this, is another house, another building, and then Shop and Save, if you know where that is on Castle Shannon Borough. It wasn't up on a hill. That's why it was here. The road has been lowered significantly. Okay, that's how high up it was. Okay, so that's the plan. We're going to go out to the bank in the car. We're going to rob the bank, jump in the getaway car, and gone. Okay, so we need to know a little bit about the people in town. Well, first is the head cashier, whose name was Daniel H.A. McLean. His wife, Agnes, had just recently died, and he was 45 years old, and that left him with 3 young children to take care of. He was a Sunday school teacher up at Mount Lebanon Presbyterian Church, which is the church right at the top of Scott Road and Mount Lebanon, or Washington Avenue, Washington Boulevard. He was well-liked, well thought of by the people in town. People and were very sympathetic to the fact that he had just lost his wife. He took his family on vacation after the mom died, and you can see the 3 kids are not exactly having the best time, okay? Nice bathing suits, okay? Okay. The second person in the bank was Frank Irby. Frank Irby was 32 years old and he lived out in Library, PA, and just told his mom that he was going to get married. He was going to get engaged, I should say, to a local girl named Leona Griner. But he, maybe I'm not sure if the picture shows it, he was considered a really handsome young man, and a bit of a flirt. The girls in town all loved him. Right across from his teller window was a bank window that looked right over to Martin's grocery store. And in the grocery store was a young girl, she was 17, who had a crush on him. And like a lot of guys who like to play that up, he would tease her, and he would, he had a tin can that he kept at his teller window, and he would run it across the bars to make a little noise. She'd look out the window and he'd yell something cute to her, and she'd yell something back, you know. And he was a bit of a flirt and a big tease, but he was supposed to be getting engaged. What's interesting was on the day of the bank robbery, gets up, eats breakfast, says to his mom, I have a really bad feeling about today. I think I'm going to take my gun with me to work. Wow. And he did. In town, when we were researching this story, there was a man in that went to church with Roger Stewart, who I wrote the article with, who said to us, hey, you need to talk to my mom. Her mom was the janitor in the bank in the time when the bank was robbed. He said, you really need to talk to her because she knows all about it. So we said, oh, great, okay. So we went and saw Margaret Stimmel, and we said to her, you know, your son said to talk with her. She was 90 or so at the time we were talking with her. And we said, you know, tell us what your mom told you about the bank robbery and all this. And we're asking her all these questions. And finally, she was terrific. She was so sharp. She said, why are you asking me about my mom? She said, I watched the whole bank robbery unfold. We're like, what? In 1997, we have an eyewitness to the robbery? She said, yeah. She said, I was home for lunch, and we lived in the Oddfellows Hall, second floor, back window that looked right down to the front of the bank. And she said when the shooting started, she got up from lunch, went, looked out the window, and watched it all unfold. Roger Stewart and I sat there spellbound for 3 hours listening to the tales that this woman had to tell. It was phenomenal. But at the time, Margaret McKellar was only 11 years old. In town was, this town had one official person of importance, and his name was George Beltshoover. He was the Justice of the Peace. He was 34 years old. And the best I can tell you is he was the biggest blowhard in town. He insisted that everyone call him Squire Beltshoover. Well, they didn't, but he really felt that he should be called Squire Beltshoover. He walked around town all the time with a big marsh-wheeling stogie sticking out of his mouth and kind of, you know, parading through town like, this is my town, okay? I'm the most important person in town. His family ran the general store and the post office. 2 doors from the bank was the home of Dr. John Carr. Dr. Carr was a physician for one of the coal companies in town, and he was a young man also. In fact, almost immediately after the bank robbery, he was drafted into the service in World War I and sent overseas. Beltshoover's family owned the store on Willow, or at that time Railroad, and this was their family store. And you can see they were also the postmasters in town, which was pretty common in those days, that you would have a contractual postmaster in your town. And always like this, probably only the people in the front row can read it. Tip Top Bread. Do you remember Tip Top Bread? Okay. You kids don't remember stuff like that, but we old fogies, we remember that.
How much was the stamp at that time?
The stamps at that time were about 2 cents. Depending on, it's funny, the stamps actually had gone down in price. Back in the Civil War, the price of a stamp for first class was 3 cents. And by this time, for some reason, it had gone down. I don't know why. Up the street from the bank, as I said, was Dr. Carr's house. Here's the bank. And this is Dr. Carr's house. This little side addition is where he had his office, where his patients would be seen. This is what the house looks like today. And again, notice the street. This is where it was before, and the street's been lowered. And as you can see, the street sloping down as you head down towards the bank. Okay.
Somebody's just living there.
Yeah, it's actually been broken up into apartments inside today, and the picture makes it look better than it is. It's actually in somewhat of a rundown condition, which is very sad. It's a beautiful house. It's an absolutely beautiful house. Some of the other people in town who would participate in the posse when the bank robbery unfolds. First, we have Joseph Offerman. He owned a clothing store on Willow Avenue, and his clerk, Mrs. Chandler, would be the first one to realize what was going on, and she alerts George Beltshoover. Where today is Kimmy's Restaurant, okay, in Castle Shannon, was J.J. Doyle's pharmacy. And up at Saxonwald Nursery was a man who was a foreman up there. His name was Ernest Fisher. And a couple months ago when I made this presentation, his granddaughter was in the audience. And she had come to talk with me about it and brought me some very interesting information about her grandfather. And he's going to figure in very prominently later on in the chase. Nicholas Yost, who participates, and he is wounded during the shootout. And then there's a man whose name is Stanley Rawa, who was the foreman at the building, South Hills Building Supplies, which is the building that's still there today on the corner of Castle Shannon Boulevard and 88. It's kind of a wedge-shaped building. They sell used cars there today. At that time, it was a lumber yard, and they had building supplies there. Rawa is a character that I have my great doubts about. There is, after reading all of the court transcripts, after reading all of the newspaper accounts, Roger Stewart and I came to the conclusion that this man was involved in the robbery. He spoke Russian. And he just happened to be in the bank at the moment of the robbery. There's more to it than that, though. Okay. The robbery. This is a map from the time period, actually, of Castle Shannon. And here you have the bank. Next to it is Martin's grocery store. Next to that is the Oddfellows Hall, where Margaret McKellar would watch the robbery unfold. Here is Waterman's Hotel, which you can see by just looking out the window. He could look straight across and sees the bank. Here's Dr. Brown's house, where they decide they're going to park their car, because from here on, it's all paved road. And from here down is only a couple hundred yards, a quick sprint up the road into the car, and off they would go. Okay, the bank itself at this time period, as you came in the front door, there was this cage directly in front of you, and you had to come in, turn, and go over to one of the two teller windows. This was Frank Irby's window, where he could look out through his teller window, through this window, to the grocery store that was right here, so he could flirt with the young girl that lived or worked right across the way. In the corner here is a chair, which is going to come into play during the robbery. In the back corner was the vault. In order to get in here, you had to go through this door and come out through that door, or you could open up these doors and come in from behind. This is an actual photograph taken the day of the robbery by one of the newspapers. And you can see this is Irby's teller window and the window directly in front of him that he could see the young lady from. Okay, so what happens then is this. On the morning of May 14th, Titoff gets up early, about 7 o'clock in the morning. He wakes up Tush and says, "It's my birthday. Let's celebrate. We're going to rob the bank." Tush says, "Okay." Let me say something about Tush before we go any further. Being politically correct, Tush was weight challenged. Okay? He was a relatively rotund man, which is going to not work in his favor during the bank robbery. So he wakes up Tush. They go and they bang on the door for Garrison, Haraska Garrison, and Sam Barkons wake them up, say the same thing. "Let's celebrate. It's my birthday." They pull out a bottle of whiskey at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they proceed to start drinking. They wake up the landlady, ask her to fry them up some meat, and while they're eating meat and drinking whiskey, they are having a good old time. And he's telling them, "Today's the day we're going to rob the bank." And they said, okay. They were in. Well, they sat there for about 2.5 hours drinking when Nick Kemenos arrives in the getaway car. They go out, they jump in the car, and they head to another bar to go drinking. They get to the bar, the four go inside. Kemenos, he doesn't know these guys. He stays in the car. Designated driver. They go into the bank. They drink for another 2 hours. By the time they come out of this little speakeasy down in the Soho area, they are plastered. They climb into the car. Barkons says, he said, "I don't even remember going to Castle Shannon." He said, "I was sound asleep as soon as I got in the car." They drive off to Castle Shannon. Now, in those days, you couldn't go through the Liberty Tunnels because they didn't exist. So you had to go around the West End and make the big bend at that time around the West End, come down what would be Sawmill Run Boulevard, which got its name because of all the sawmills that were along that stream that was cutting up all the wood that was going into the mines. I read one thing that said that there were at one point 72 sawmills that were along Sawmill Run from Castle Shannon all the way down to McKees Rocks, where it empties in to the river. So they go up Sawmill Run Boulevard, or at that time Road, I don't know what it was called, and they finally drive into Castle Shannon, and they park the car at Dr. Brown's. They get out, they start walking down the street. This looks like something out of a John Wayne movie, I suppose. These four men walking down the street. Kemenos stays in the car. He's not going there to get a job in a coal mine. He's got a good job. He drives a good car. He's sitting in the car and actually testifies that he goes to sleep. As they're walking down the street, somehow, somewhere, Titoff pulls 4 guns out of his pockets, hands each one of the robbers a gun. Each man has an automatic pistol, which amazes me for the time period. I would have thought they all would have had revolvers. They didn't. They all had automatics. Most of them were 7mm or 32 calibers. Well, they come down the street, round the corner, and they walk up to the bank. Now, just to simplify this for you, these 2 triangles are actually the 4 men. I figured if I put 4 triangles in there, it'd be a mess. Anyway, they walk into the bank, and as they get up to the window where Frank Irby is, here is Stanley Rawa cashing a $100 check.
It's a lot of money in those days.
That's a lot of money. And as they walk up to the window, one man comes to one side of him, another man comes to the other side, and Rawa testifies, I suddenly realized that something wasn't right, and I began to back away. As he backed away, Tush grabs him and says, sit in that chair. So he goes over and he sits in the chair, and Tush, amazingly, pulls out a piece of rope out of his pocket to tie Stanley Rawa up. Why was he carrying a piece of rope to a bank robbery? This doesn't make sense. He ties him to the chair. Rawa testifies that the rope is so short, he can't make a knot. And yet, Rawa is tied to the chair. Okay? Well, at this point, everything breaks loose. Irby, realizing what's happening, because suddenly he's got guns in his faces, grabs his pistol, which is under his counter, dives back under his desk, and the shooting starts. And it is furious. Shots are just ringing out all over the place. As that happens, Daniel McLean comes walking out of the vault, and he's carrying a ledger book. And if you know what a ledger book looked like in those days, they were great big books. And as he walks out, he just steps out just as the shooting starts, sees what's happening, throws the book up in front of his face, and a bullet comes through the book and hits him in the forehead. And he goes down. At that point, two of the men rush in, clean out the vault, and head for the front door. Okay, as all of that is happening, over in Offerman's men's clothing store, Mrs. Chandler hears all this shooting. The windows are all open. It's May. It's a beautiful day outside. She realizes instantly that the bank's being robbed. She runs out. She tells Joseph Offerman, the owner of the store, they're robbing the bank. She runs out front, and who is walking down Washington Road but George Squire Beltoover, smoking his big stogie. Does she call him Squire? No, she runs out, she yells, George, they're robbing the bank. George is stunned. I'm sure he was hearing the gunshots, but it hadn't registered. He realizes instantly what's going on, and he takes off running until he gets to the end of Poplar, where there's an embankment, as I said, that they would later cut out. And as he comes up, he's going to have to scramble up this little embankment to get up onto Railroad Street, or Willow Avenue today. As he's doing that, Joseph Offerman comes running out of his men's clothing store with a pistol in each hand. And he comes running up, and George, remember, he's really important, says, give me those guns. And he takes both of the pistols away from Offerman, who at that point says, okay, and leaves. He continues taking about 10 steps, and up comes a guy whose name was Mike, I can never remember his last name, Mike Galco. And Mike Galco comes running up, and he's carrying a shotgun, a pump shotgun. And he looks at it, and Beltoover says, oh, man, I'd rather have a shotgun than a pistol. And so he grabs the shotgun out of Mike's hands and hands him one of the pistols. He takes about another 2 steps, and Dr. Carr pulls up in his car and says, what's going on? He says, they're robbing the bank. Hands him one of the pistols. And then he says, okay, let's go on up the street to Martin's grocery store. They get up to Martin's grocery store, and they stand on the front porch, because the bank's steps are right here. And they're doing, one of these, looking over. They hear all this shooting going on. And George says, let me see what's going on. And much to his credit, okay, he walks up to the front door, he looks in the front door to see what's going on, and he backs down to the bottom step, and he waits. He yells over to Dr. Carr, go to the back door. Dr. Carr runs down the alley and stands here at the back door to guard the back door in case they try to come out that way. As he's doing that, as he gets down there, the bank robbers come out the front door, and there is George standing at the bottom of those steps with a shotgun. I hope you've seen the movie True Grit, because this is like a scene out of True Grit. He yells, "Throw up your hands, you sons of bitches!" And these guys look at him. Now remember, they are dead drunk, all right? They're standing 4 steps away from him, and they start shooting. Boom, 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 boom. George, no fool, pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. He pumps the shotgun, click, pumps it a 3rd time, click, and in his trial testimony he says, it wouldn't go off. I throwed it back. I tried it 3 times. There was nothing come from it. There was nothing in the gun. He traded 2 loaded pistols for an empty shotgun. George says in the trial, he says, it got a little warm at the bottom of the steps. He's got 4 guys shooting at him, all right?
Well, who had the other pistol, though?
The one was Mike Galco, and the other one was the doctor.
Oh, okay.
Galco, I guess, is probably glued to the wall at this point. He probably, we don't know what happens with Galco. Galco didn't speak very much English. In fact, in the trial, excuse my lack of political correctness, when he handed the squire the shotgun, he says, Mr. Squire, you take this gun. This no good gun for a hunky like me. No hunky can shoot shotgun.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay? That's his trial testimony. Okay. Anyway, which was obvious that he couldn't shoot the gun because he didn't even know how to load it, obviously. All right. So, at this point, Beltshoover, okay, being that he didn't want to get killed, he takes off running to the back of the bank. Picks up Dr. Carr as he comes around, and they stop here. Well, they get there. The bank robbers, seeing him take off in that direction, take off in that direction. As they get to the corner of the back corner of the bank, the one bank robber is carrying a bag of silver dollars. As he gets to the back of the bank, there's Beltshoover. He takes that bag of silver dollars and he hits him square in the face with this bag, which was like being hit with a sledgehammer, and it just explodes his nose. And his nose is broken. He is knocked almost unconscious. He falls back on Dr. Carr, and he's just bleeding profusely at that point. If you've ever seen a broken nose, they bleed like crazy. They really do. And he's dazed. He really doesn't even know what's going on at this point. Well, at this point, this is where the story diverges in 2 directions. The 4 robbers run back to the front. As they get to the front, gunfire from across the street erupts. The young girl from Martin's grocery store had gone home for lunch. While she's at lunch, she hears the shooting. She realizes immediately what's going on, and her beau, Frank Irby's in the bank battling for his life, and she realizes it. She runs upstairs, gets her dad's deer rifle, takes a sniper's perch in the front bedroom, and starts shooting across the street at the 4 bank robbers who have just come around back to the front. They, at this point, remember, they are dead drunk. They don't know what to do. They panic, and 2 bank robbers head in this direction, and 2 bank robbers head off in this direction. So we're going to follow the 2 that head off towards Dr. Carr's house. The first 2 bank robbers take off running. They actually go through Dr. Carr's backyard, jump over his fence, go through the yard, and they run up the street, which heads towards the golf course today. If you've ever been up that street, it's like most Pittsburgh streets. And Tush and Barkons, who are running side by side, Tush is having trouble. He is too heavy. He can't keep up. He is struggling.
Who had the broken nose?
George Beltuver. Beltuver is standing at the back of the bank, bleeding all over the doctor. Up walks J.J. Doyle from the pharmacy, no gun in hand. The doctor is working with Beltuver. Beltuver turns to Doyle and says, "Here, take this shotgun. You and Dr. Carr chase these guys." Now remember, the doctor was behind the bank. He has no idea that the shotgun's empty. Okay? Doyle takes the shotgun. The 2 of them take off, and because they know the town, they realize that they can outflank them. Doyle goes up this way, the doctor goes up this way, because what's going to happen is these guys are going to go up the hill, they're going to turn and go down into a ravine, and the doctor and Doyle will be above them. As they get up over the hill, they see the bank robbers coming up below them, coming up the ravine, and they're shooting at each other. Tush has had enough. He stops, he yells to Sam Barkons, "Shoot yourself." And then he takes the gun and he kills himself. Barkons stops, runs back, picks up his gun, because when he jumped to the fence in Dr. Carr's backyard, his gun fell out of his pocket. And he didn't have his gun. He grabs the gun, takes off running. As he's coming up the ridge, Doyle takes aim, click, suddenly realizes he's got an empty gun. He yells over to the doctor, "I'm going back for ammunition and more help." The doctor says, "Okay." The doctor chases Barkons up through the golf course, with Doyle coming back into town, and Tush has shot himself, and then Barkons turns and heads down because he sees woods. This is Sleepy Hollow Road, okay? Those woods are still there, actually, okay? And they were called the Wild Woods at that time. The doctor chases him across the golf course, gets to the top of the woods, looks in, and this is one of the few areas where the wood hasn't been touched by the coal mines. And it's thick and it's dark. And the doctor says, "I'm not going in there." And he stops at the top and he waits for help to come. By the way, in the length of time I'm telling you this, this is about twice as long as it takes for all this to occur. Okay? So just bear with me. Meanwhile, no, not yet. We're not to the other 2 yet. Meanwhile, Saxonwald Greenhouse gets a phone call. They robbed the bank. The bank robbers are crossing the golf course. They're headed your way. The owner, his name is a German name, Muschke or something like that, says to the foreman, Ernest Fisher, "Go home, get your guns." This was his home. He runs over, gets his guns, jumps in his car, drives down to Grove, okay, where the Grove is, parks his car at the Grove, and he starts walking up. And this is Sleepy Hollow Road at that time period. If you know Sleepy Hollow Road, this literally right here is a train trestle. Okay? The bend in the road is still there. They built this road. They didn't even bother to straighten it out. Okay? Their bend is still there after all these years. Anyway, he starts walking down this road, and there's a farmer's house down here. And it's like a bad joke. The farmer and his daughter are standing out at the front gate. Fisher walks up to them, and the farmer says, are you looking for someone? He said, yeah. He said, have you seen someone? He said, yeah, some guy just came down through the woods, and he's laying down in the ground up there by those trees. Fisher says, got him. He's got his deer rifle, and he starts into the woods. He's a deer hunter, I suppose. Gets into the woods and very quietly stalking through the woods, sees 2 trees laying there, and he sees a set of feet sticking out from the trees. He walks up very quietly, gets right up to him, puts the gun right up to his head and yells, don't move or I'll blow your head off. Gets no reaction. Just then, coming down through the woods, is the doctor, J.J. Doyle, Joseph Opperman, and a couple other townspeople. They come flying down. They see Sam Barkons laying there between the 2 logs. J.J. Doyle, who was good friends with Frank Irby, has found out that Irby's been mortally wounded. He is furious. He gets down, he grabs Barkon, pulls him up, and proceeds to beat the living daylights out of this guy. And then they suddenly realize he's not responding. He has this dazed look on his face. The dazed look was because he had shot himself in the head. He had taken the pistol, put it in his mouth, pulled the trigger, the bullet went. I couldn't make this up. It went perfectly between the 2 lobes of his brain, hit nothing, and came out of the top of his head. He was hurting, but it didn't do anything. Well, they drag him down Sleepy Hollow Road, throw him in the back seat of Fisher's car, and drive him up to Beltshoover's house. Meanwhile, the other two started running up the street. As they're running, people throughout the town are starting to come out to chase them. And this is a time period where everybody had guns. As they're chasing them up the street, they're being shot at. The robbers are terrified at this point. They're not stopping to take aim. They're simply shooting back over their shoulder like this, just trying to scare them away. Down here at the Castle Shannon Railroad Station was Nicholas Yost, who in his desk drawer happened to have his 2 pistols. And he pulls out his 2 pistols and comes running up onto the road just as the bank robbers go by. And again, this is a scene out of some Wild West show. He's running down the street with 2 pistols, boom, 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 boom. The bank robbers are shooting back at him. Nobody's hitting anything until one of the bank robbers throws a shot out over his shoulder and hits Nicholas Yost in the leg, and Yost goes down. Incredible, unfortunate, unlucky shot in that sense, and Yost is out of the chase. They get to the car. Kemenos is hearing all the commotion. He wakes up and he yells, what's going on? And they're yelling, start the car, start the car. And they run, they jump in the car, and Kemenos got the car running. He goes, what's going on? And they said, we got into a fight in one of the bars, and everybody in town's mad at us. And he said, okay, let's go. Boom, puts the car in gear, and off they go. At this point, George Beltshoover is now getting his senses back. He's gone home. His mom cleaned up his face a bit. He's kind of, back to getting back to normal. He comes running out of their store, and at this point, of course, he's grabbed his own guns, And he comes out, and the posse is all forming in town. Everybody's, of course, waiting for George because George is in charge. And he comes out, and they said, George, we got to get him. He says, okay, let's go. Let's get some cars. And they said, well, we don't have any cars. So they run down to Laughlin Funeral Home, and they say to Ed Laughlin, can we borrow your hearse? And he says, sure. I love this picture. See what it says? Laughlin, funeral director and embalmer, livery, boarding, sales, stables, moving, and general hauling. So when you're not using your hearse to drag bodies around, okay, you can do general hauling, right? You help people move. Anyway, so Laughlin says, well, sure, you can take the hearse, but first you got to get the wagon out of the way. So they had to pull a wagon out of here first, and all the men are in there, and they're pushing the wagon out, and then they go in, and they push the car out, and the car, of course, is a crank, and they got to crank the car up, crank it up. They get 11 guys in the car. Okay, and off they go. Meantime, another car did arrive. I don't know if it was Dr. Kerr's car. I'm not sure whose car it was. They get another car. There's more guys in that, and off they go. They go flying up Washington Avenue, Castle Shannon Boulevard, and the chase goes all the way to Green Tree Road. They get up to Green Tree Road, and there ahead of them, going down the road at about 5 miles an hour, is Nick Kimenos in an empty car. They come flying up, they pull him over, yank him out of the car. Where's your friends? He said, oh, they said they didn't like the way I drove. They got out of the car a couple of miles back. They said, what do you mean? They said, they didn't want to ride with me anymore. Well, they didn't believe him, so of course, they beat him up, all right? And they beat him ferociously. In fact, later on when the Allegheny County detectives arrived to take custody of these two guys, the one detective would testify at trial that Kimenos' face was so swollen he couldn't even make out any features on his face. His face was just a mass from the beating. They bring him back and they search him. He has $10 on him. That's it. There's no money in the car. There's no weapons in the car. There's nothing. Well, Barkons is taken to Southside Hospital where he recovers fully, totally. In fact, the next day, they go in and question him. And he's, lucid, no problem, talks with him. And the one nurse who happened to speak Russian does the interpreting for them. And they find out that he has absolutely no idea where Titoff and Garrison Haraska have gone because that wasn't part of the plan. Or maybe it was, and he didn't know it. Because what they think happened was that when they jumped out of the car, there were abandoned coal mines in that area of Green Tree. And they think that they may have gone into one of the coal mines to hide until the coast was clear. And the pursuit was after Kimenos, which completely threw off these amateur vigilantes and not realizing that they needed to go back and search for the other two. And they get away.
What happened to the guy that was in the bank tied to the chair?
Stanley Rawa. The bank robbers leave. Remember, he's tied to a chair. He proceeds to stand up and walk out of the bank. He testifies later that first Tush spoke to him in English and then spoke to him in Russian. Really? Why would he speak to him in Russian? What would give him the idea that Rawa spoke Russian? Nobody, and there's more stuff in the trial transcripts. First of all, Rawa's story changes every time he tells it. In the 4 different transcripts that we have, his story is told 4 different ways. Nobody seems to have ever picked up on it until we did our research. Then we said, there is something really fishy about this whole thing. Okay. So, Rawa walks away. Well, what happened? Daniel McLean was shot in the head and the leg. Mrs. McKellar, Margaret's mom, over at the Oddfellows, the janitor, she comes over to the bank, sits down on the floor with him, and cradles him in her lap until he dies. Irby, and you can tell Irby was in a gunfight. He's shot in the head, the back, the chest, the right arm, the left shoulder. He dies on the way to Southside Hospital.
Oh, wow.
When the bank robbers are brought back to town,
There's only 3. 4.
there were 4 altogether.
Yeah, but the one died.
One kills himself, okay?
Yeah.
The other one shoots himself, but he's alive. 2 escape,
Right.
but then you have Kemenos.
Oh, I forgot.
As far as they were concerned, he was a bank robber. He
Okay.
pleads not guilty, but that's not good. Okay, so Irby dies. Well, because these 2 men were tremendously loved in the community, the women in the town are furious. At the trial, the one Allegheny County detective testifies that the people in the town were screaming to hang these men right then and there. And he said, actually, it was mainly the women. The women wanted to take these guys out and lynch them on the spot. They were furious. Over $17,000 was taken. About $9,000 was recovered. And look at this. And this is, Dick got me invited to a club of collectors. And this guy collects bills like this. This is a Castle Shannon, First National Bank, Castle Shannon banknote. Okay? Which I found incredibly fascinating. Didn't even know it existed. Anyway, so Titoff and Horaska Garrison have gotten away with somewhere in the neighborhood of $8,000, which in that time period was huge. And they simply vanish. Disappeared without a trace. When they went and talked to Titoff's sister out in Universal, they said to her, "What do you think?" She said, "My guess is he went to New York, jumped on a freighter, and went back to Russia. Because with $8,000 in Russia, he's going to be a wealthy man. Except it's 1917. What happens in Russia in October 1917? The revolution, and all the money of everybody is confiscated. So if he goes back to Russia, he probably ended up with nothing. But we don't know what happened to him. He could have gone virtually anywhere. Sam Barkhans was put on trial. He was found guilty. He was executed. This is the guy that shot himself through the top of the head, all right? And no one claimed the body.
Where is Rockville?
Down past Harrisburg, somewhere in that Lancaster or Harrisburg area. This is interesting. Kemenos, the getaway car driver. He's put on trial first for the murder of Frank Irby, and he's found innocent. So they said, all right, let's try again. Put him on trial for Daniel McLean's murder, and he's found guilty. Well, his lawyers immediately file an appeal for double jeopardy, saying, you can't do that. It's basically the same crime. You're trying him twice for basically the same. Today, this would be double jeopardy, okay? But before his case is heard, he dies in prison during the Great Spanish Flu epidemic. I just threw this in because I find this unbelievably interesting. The Stanley Cup that year was called off because of the flu epidemic.
Where was that? What year?
1919.
Really?
Yeah, 1919.
Get out.
Can you imagine that? They canceled the Stanley Cup. Wow. Would there have been a revolution in Pittsburgh yesterday, or?
Heck no.
Okay. What about the kids? The three kids, Margaret, Harold, and Raymond. Margaret had a daughter who we interviewed, and she told us all about her mom. Her mom, the day her dad died, was killed. Someone knocked on their front door, was carrying his lunch bucket, said to her, "Here's your dad's lunch bucket. He was killed at the bank today. Have a nice day."
How old was she, Lovett?
15. The three kids were split up, put into three different families within their own family, okay? I mean, within their own relatives. But Margaret couldn't take it. She ran away at 16, got married at 16, had a baby by 17, was divorced by 20. Lived the rest of her life on her own. Raised her daughter, who I said we got to interview, put herself through college, became a professional of some sort, I forget now. When you think about that story, and you compare it to just about anything you've ever heard of the Wild West, you have to admit that this is right up there among them as one of the great, great stories of vigilantism, of heroism, of tragedy. It's just an amazing story, I think, overall. And it's one that I just felt like I kind of have to keep alive because so many people in Pittsburgh have never even heard the story. Okay. Okay. Anything else? I'm sorry if I dragged this too long, but thank you.